Well, hey guys, welcome back. A question that I've been asked quite a few times before is, do I actually make stuff with the tools that I make here on the channel? And the truth is, whilst most of the stuff that I make here on the channel is made because I enjoy it as a hobby, the things that I make that are useful are wood stuff. I guess you'd call it woodworking. And whilst I do enjoy it quite a lot, I've been doing it for years, I much prefer to work with metal. I just find it a lot more fun, and I'm sure you guys find it a lot more fun to watch. Which I guess brings us to this mini plane, which I made last year. Great project, heaps of fun, and I've been able to use it in quite a few of my woodworking projects since then. It's great for adding chamfers and smoothing over small pieces of wood. All in all, great piece of kit. However, it is a little bit small. I mean, it is small on purpose, but it is a bit small for some of the projects that I have coming up. And by that I mean I'm in need of a larger plane. Something that I can use to smooth down long cuts. I'm guessing some sort of jack plane. I'm guessing anyway. I enjoy woodworking, but I'm not an expert in it. With that said though, I think a jack plane should work and it should be a fun project to build. And I do mean build. I had a look online at some of the prices and yeah, I'm definitely going to be building one. I'm sure those ones are really good pieces of kit, and if you do a lot of woodworking, it would be more than worth the price. But considering that I do woodworking every now and then, I really can't justify, spending $300+ on a plane. Now over the computer, I have done a basic design in SolidWorks. Just so I know roughly what I'm making, which in this case is just going to be a low angle jack plane. Pretty basic design so far, but I really like the look of it. I think it's also important to have a design done up in SolidWorks because I need to keep track of how everything will screw together. And this is going to be the biggest difference between an off-the-shelf plane and the one that I'm going to be making, because the one that I'm going to be making is going to be made from steel flat bar. Not exactly my first choice of metal, but, it's strong, it's durable, it's machinable, it's steel. However, it is obviously the wrong shape. A proper plane is going to be made from either cast iron or cast steel, and as a result, the whole frame is going to be made as one single piece. It would be nice to do that as one casting because it would make the design a lot more straightforward and probably make it a lot stronger, but unfortunately, trying to cast iron in my furnace just isn't possible. One day I would like to explore trying to do it in aluminium bronze because aluminium bronze is incredibly strong and pretty tough, and most importantly you can cast it in a home furnace, but that's just going to have to be a project for another day. Plus I probably need to nick some copper wire first. This stuff don't come cheap. So instead I have a bunch of steel and I'm simply going to bolt it together. But if we do it correctly, we can build up the basic frame and shape that we need and it should work just fine. I guess if you really wanted to, you could probably make it from one solid piece of bar stock and just machine away a lot of the excess, but doing that would be pretty expensive and I think I can get really good results doing it this way. So I've got the plans printed out, so let's start to cut it down and let's see if we can make this work. Also worth pointing out that these are quick and nasty plans and these are not great examples of technical drawings, but the only person who needs to understand it is me, so these are more than good enough. Alright, so that's all the steel pieces now cut up. Obviously not to final shape, but this is roughly how it's going to line up. Now one thing that you might notice is that unlike the first plane that I made, this one here has two pieces of metal which will comprise that front section. And the reason for that is to give this plane an adjustable throat. It effectively allows us to adjust the amount of gap in the slot of the plane. And we can do it by moving that bottom plate forwards and backwards. And my understanding is that it can help prevent tear out when you're planing wood. And apparently it is a bit more of a premium feature, not all planes have one, so if I'm going to be making a plane myself, I might as well make it and see just how well it works. So the first thing that I want to do is clean up all the parts. Clean up all the edges and square them up. Now whilst doing it for the small pieces was pretty straightforward. Doing it for the long pieces was a little bit more difficult. There's obviously going to be a lot of overhang and not much support. Honestly, at this point, I could really go for a second matched vise. Now initially I thought I could get away with some 1-2-3 block trickery in the vise to machine the flat bar, but I could tell it really wasn't all that rigid. So instead I clamped it to an angle block, and that seemed to work just fine. The other two pieces of bar which make up the sides are a little bit longer, so as well as clamping it to an angle block, I had to clamp it to a 1-2-3 block, and that made the setup rigid enough. And that's all the pieces of steel now that they've been squared up and cut roughly down to final size. However, some pieces are still too thick and all of them need their mill scale removed. So I'll take them back to the mill and I'll use a face mill to quickly remove a bulk of the material. The face mill does a fantastic job at quickly removing material, but it does leave a pretty rough finish, so I'll then clean it up with a fly cutter. And for those thin pieces of steel, I'll skip using the face mill and only use the fly cutter. I'm always really happy with this fly cutter, it leaves a fantastic finish. Alright, and those are the small pieces now done. However, I still have the long pieces left to do, and cleaning these up is going to be a lot more difficult than the smaller pieces. They're long and thin, and fly cutting them is going to be quite difficult. Now for the side pieces, I simply took the easy way out, and I ground them down using the belt sander. For what it's worth, I don't mind having a brushed finish on the side, so this will work out just fine. However, for this middle piece, it needs to be milled down on the milling machine. I need it to be flat, and I need to take off about 2mm off the height. So instead, here is the crazy fixturing setup which I dreamt up. Now I intentionally left this one piece to be a little bit oversized, which would allow me to machine in a cutout at one end. I'll now get some 1-2-3 blocks and some T-nuts and all thread and try and use it to create some sort of support for the end to rest on. The end gets bolted directly to the 1-2-3 blocks, and hopefully that should be enough to hold everything in place and make it rigid enough so it doesn't chatter. Not my craziest setup, but probably one of the more ugly ones, but thankfully it did work. I guess that's just machining sometimes, you just gotta figure out what works and go with it. And once the first side was machined, we can now flip the part, machine in a new notch, Break an end mill, although this part isn't compulsory. And once that's machined and looking really good, we can then cut the excess off the end and then square it up. And that finally are all the parts now cleaned up and squared up and taken to their rough final size. I know that it probably doesn't look like a whole lot, but doing all this took at least a day and a half to do. Well, probably half a day to do the first bit, and then a lot of tea drinking and scratching just to see how I could do those final 3 bits. But I'm really happy with how they turned out, so let's move on to the next step. And that's going to be to get a lot of holes drilled and tapped. Like I mentioned before, this is all going to be held together by screws, and I have all the hole positions already mapped out. This is easily one of the biggest advantages of drawing it up in SolidWorks, rather than just drilling holes and doing it all on the fly. With all that said though, this is not a good example of a knee drawing, but it does provide enough information to get us going. So I'll get the pieces loaded up and we'll start drilling. Now the screws that I'm going to be using are going to be countersunk screws, so the holes will also be countersunk. And because there's a lot of stick out and flex, and I want to do this all as one operation, I will need to use a jack so the end piece doesn't bend over when I'm drilling. Alright, and those are the holes now drilled on the 2 outside pieces. 3 screws on each side for the back piece and 2 on each side for the front. And as you can probably see, the 2 on the front are slightly raised, and this will be to allow for that moving section on the bottom. So I'll now take the 2 middle pieces and get the holes drilled and tapped. The screws that I'm using here are going to be M5, and that is pretty much as large as I could go for the pieces of steel that I'm using here. Alright, and that's the basic frame now roughly put together. It is quite a bit longer than I thought it would be, going off the picture that I did on the computer, but overall I'm really happy with the basic size. I do want to stress though that the screws that I'm using here to hold it all together are not going to be the same screws that I'll use for the final assembly. If I do it correctly, you won't see any screws when it's all finally put together. Although it still has a fair way to go before we can do that. So the next thing that I want to tackle is the adjustable throat. As you can see, there is now space there for a piece of plate, and it slides in like so. What I need to do now is machine in a slot for the bottom piece, and machine in a stud for the moving piece. So I'll start off by drilling a 10mm hole, which I'll then enlarge with a 2-flute slot drill. And after a bit of deburring, that is the slot now machined. We have about 10mm worth of movement, which is easily more than enough for what I need here. So with the slot now cut, let's start to make the stud. So over at the lathe, I'll turn down a section and then cut some threads. We can now part it off and then machine down the other side and then get the threads cut. And that's the stud made, complete with threads. I had to cut the threads by hand in the vise. I'd show you it, but unfortunately I didn't hit record on the camera. But I'm sure you all know roughly what that process looks like. I'll then take the bottom plate and then drill all the way through. I'll then get that hole tapped. The stud then gets Loctited into the bottom plate. Obviously there's a bit sticking out the bottom, which I can then just machine away. It's still left a little bit oversized, which will be fixed at a later point. But outside of that, it's looking really good so far. We have more than enough travel and adjustment in the throat, and I think this will be really useful when it comes time to using this as an actual plane. Although getting to that point is still a long way away. So the next thing that I need to do is get the plane ripped apart, because what we need to do now is machine in a 12-degree angle on that back piece. This will be for the blade to rest on, and it will help create the cutting angle. I'm no expert, but from what I read, 12 degrees is pretty common for a low angled plane like this. Now, as well as machining in the angle on this back piece, I'll also be machining that angle into a block which will screw into the piece. Now, the reason for this block is to add a bit of height because it's not currently tall enough, and it will also contain the thread for the adjustment mechanism for the blade. First things first though, I need an angle block. I don't currently have one in 12 degrees, so I'll make one myself from a piece of off-cut metal. I'll then take the top angle block and start to machine in a recess for the screws. 2 screws should be more than enough because there isn't going to be a whole lot of force going through this block. I can then drill and tap 2 corresponding holes in the bottom piece, although these holes won't be going all the way through the block. With it now bolted in place, I can now get it in the mill, use the angle block to set the angle, and then I'll use the face mill to machine in that angle. Now, because that back piece is only being held in by 2 bolts, I'm using brand new inserts on the face mill and I'm taking very light cuts just so I don't break or bend the block. And once the angle was established, I'll then swap it out for a fly cutter and then take a very light cut, just to clean it up and make it look a little bit nicer. I'll then take an end mill and then start to machine away the back of the block, so the back is perpendicular to the angle which we just cut. And the final thing I'll do with it set up like this is I'll drill and tap a hole at the front. This will be for a locking stud and this will be used to hold everything in place. And I want all the force to be going through that bottom piece, which is why I drilled it at the front rather than on the angle block. The final thing I'll do is I'll rip the angle block off the back and then I'll drill a hole all the way through it. I'll then tap it for M5, and this is all going to be used for the adjustment screw. Alright, with that now done, that is now the basic frame of the plane now done. And unfortunately, that is where I'm going to leave it for this week. I'm not sure if it felt like a lot of work for you, but this was about 1.5 weeks worth of work and about 300 shots of video edited down into this. The important thing is that we now have the basic frame of the plane now established. It's feeling really solid and really strong. And I think we have the makings of a really great plane right here. But there is still a lot of work left to do. Heat treatments, blades, cap irons, woodworking, adjustment mechanisms, making it look like a nice usable plane. The list goes on. So I guess I'll see you in part number 2 next week. Thank you very much for watching, hope you enjoyed it, take care.